Matt is going to talk about the materials project, data tools, and community for materials design. Go ahead.
Thanks very much, Richard. It's an absolute pleasure to be talking with you all today. I'm talking here from California on the west coast of America. So I understand that the purpose of this workshop is to try and foster good collaboration. So I really hope that some collaborations can come out of this. And if anything in this talk is interesting, I really encourage anybody to reach out to me afterwards. I would be delighted to talk some more about it. So I'm here representing the Materials Project, which is a project out of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. This talk, I want to talk a little bit about some of the data tools we have available that are hopefully useful for materials design, and also the community that we've tried to grow around the Materials Project. So this talk will be split into 4 segments. The first part will just be a little bit of a summary of what we do for people who are unfamiliar. Then I want to talk a little bit about how we write the code that supports our work and the collaborative coding that we do. And then I want to talk about some data analysis and machine learning tools and how they can lead to the design of new materials. And then finally, I want to talk about a new initiative that we have for helping to share scientific data on the website and help build an audience for that data. So to start with, what is the Materials Project? The Materials Project started in 2011 out of a US government initiative called the Materials Genome Initiative, with the mission of creating open web-based access to computed information on materials and analysis tools to design novel materials. So what does this mean? Well, we ask the question of how do we design materials? We have an urgent need to find new materials to address the climate crisis and other technological needs. However, we have a problem in that there are many hundreds of thousands of materials available, and it raises the question of how do we find and select the right materials for a given application. The traditional way to do this has been to choose a material to sorry, excuse me a second. I have some Zoom covering some of my slides. I'm going to have to pause a second just because I can't read my own slides as well as I would like. I apologize for this. 1 second. All right, here we go. The traditional approach is to choose a material, to synthesize that material, to characterize that material, and then based on that characterization to maybe optimize the growth, to recharacterize again. This process might take several months or several years. And then at the end of that process, the material might actually not be suitable for your application. You might have to discard that material and have to start this process all over again. This approach scales poorly. So trying this for a number of materials might take decades, might take a very large number of resources, might exceed the length time of any one individual working on a project. So this is known as the Edisonian approach. And the question is, can we do better given that we now have access to more computational resources than we used to have access to? So this is the dream of an in silico approach, which is the idea of using computation as a pre-screening step to help find the ideal new materials and to help guide experiments. So the idea here is not that in silico is going to replace the need for experimentation, but just that it might help to get started and to give additional context and therefore to save time when going through this materials discovery process. So what we do at Materials Project, because we have access to a large amount of computing resources via the NERSC Supercomputing Center, we're able to construct computational workflows which help us run repeat calculations that are very similar to each other and repeat these automatically so that we can then generate large amounts of data without human intervention. The general idea of this approach is that the workflows that we're running are not necessarily individually that sophisticated. If you're going to do some dedicated calculations, it's very likely you'll be able to do higher quality calculations than we do at scale with our workflows. But the advantage of this is that you only need to do this once. If you have 100,000 materials and you can generate a large quantity of sufficiently reliable information, this can be useful for everybody. It saves time so that we don't need to repeat each other's calculations, and we can have a common starting ground. So what does one of these workflows look like? At its most basic, we have, for example, a thermodynamic stability workflow, which will just ask the question of under from a thermodynamic perspective, will a material decompose? So this workflow uses density functional theory, which gives us a very cheap estimate of formation enthalpy. Whenever we develop a workflow, we compare to experiment to assess reliability and to benchmark our data to make sure that our workflows are reliable, but also to give people an idea of how much error they might expect in the values that we report compared to experiment. And then we find applications for this data, so different ways to analyze the data for given applications. So here, for example, when you have formational enthalpy for a large set of materials, you can start to construct convex hulls, which allow you to assess stability across chemical space, and start to ask questions, for example, of how metastable is too metastable for a compound to be synthesizable. Another example of a workflow that we develop is to calculate, say, the elastic tensor for a material to tell us how a material responds to stress. Again, we benchmark to experiment and to assess reliability, and then we find new applications for it. So for example, once we have this large data set of elastic tensors, we can start to ask questions like, what substrates are suitable to grow a given material on because they don't have too much elastic strain at the interface of those materials. So we have a lot of these workflows available now. So we have workflows for phonon band structures, for defects, for magnetism, for electronic band structures, grain boundaries. Some of these workflows have been run on 100,000 materials. Other workflows, like the grain boundaries, have only been run on elemental materials. But together, we're now having a fairly good coverage of different kinds of materials properties. The time it takes to develop one of these workflows is typically a team of people, maybe a graduate student and a postdoc, and it can take anywhere from, say, 6 months to several years. But once these workflows are available, they allow us to run them on a new material in a matter of days and get these the properties that we want. So what do we do with these data? With this data, it is always made public. So we run and track hundreds of thousands of these workflows for our production database, and then we always make them publicly available so that they can be downloaded by anybody from our website. So this is just to give an idea of the size of this database and how it's grown over the years. This chart is actually a few years out of date now, but we currently have over 120,000 crystalline compounds. We also have a number of molecules for purposes of screening electrolytes, for batteries. We have nanoporous materials. We have band structures. We also have now X-ray absorption spectra, which can be useful for experimental characterization. So these are X-ray absorption spectra for individual atomic sites in a crystal structure. So I think we have of the order of several 100,000 X-ray absorption spectra now, and we're initially this was K-edge, and now we're adding L-edge as well. So the key thing about this database is that it's not only available via the Materials Project website, but it's also available to download via an API, which means you can download as many of these records as you need to download, tens of thousands of crystal structures at a time as necessary. And then finally, on the website, we have apps available which allow for interactive analysis of data, like exploring the data in ways that are relevant for battery materials, or to construct phase diagrams or aqueous stability pore bay diagrams. If you want to see, for example, if a material is going to be stable in an aqueous environment. So all of these sort of different views into the data are just different ways of analyzing the data that we provide for specific applications. So the next thing I want to talk about is kind of how the Materials Project came to be. So I actually joined this project in 2016. But it started back in 2011, and to make this website and to provide to generate all these workflows, all these calculations, actually relies upon a huge stack of tools and software that have been developed now by quite a large number of people. So just to sort of give a quick survey of these tools that are available. We have Fireworks, which is our workflow management software, which allows us to organize and keep track of all of these calculations. We have PyMatGen, which is a materials analysis code that allows us to make transformations to crystal structures and do the things like generate the convex hulls and the phase diagrams. We have Custodian, which is an error correction tool, which will automatically detect errors in your calculation as you are running these calculations to so that if there is an error, it can be recovered from without human intervention. Because when we're running these large number of calculations, it's not feasible for us to go in on an individual calculation basis and correct errors. We have Animate, which provides a lot of recipes. So this is useful if, for example, especially if you're a novice to density functional theory, or if you just want a systematic way of running a large number of calculations. This contains recipes for common materials science tasks. For example, if you want to generate a band structure, it will take in a crystal structure, it will calculate the k-path in reciprocal space that you might want. It will generate the inputs for your calculation. It will run that calculation. It will put the outputs in a database, and it will do all of that for you just based on the input structure. And then we're developing other tools to actually make the web apps themselves. And then there have also been other tools that have not been developed by the Materials Project ourselves, but have been developed by collaborators or colleagues and designed in a way that makes it easy to interact with the data that is coming out of the Materials Project database. And I'll be talking a little bit more about these in a moment. So just as a case study for how we do this development, I want to highlight one of these codes, which is PyMatGen, which is a code that I work on quite a lot, which is used to do these crystal structure transformations and to build phase diagrams, etc. It's also used to download data from the Materials Project database. So it gives some, if you want to write a script that downloads, say, 10,000 crystal structures, you'll probably end up using PyMatGen. And it also helps to do input and output for a variety of material science codes like VASP, like Quantum Espresso, like LAMPS, and other tools that we're using. So all of our code is developed in the open. So since PyMatchN started, it's now seen 21,000 sort of individual code commits. So the entire history of the project is available online, so that you can go back and see, how a particular line of code or particular function was developed, how it changed, from its inception, how functionality grew, who wrote a specific line of code. Often, this is not so much true these days, depending who you talk to, but sometimes when I've given talks like this before, the question comes, well, if you develop in the open, will somebody steal my code? What does this mean if you're working on something before it's been disclosed, so you haven't published a paper yet? Is there a concern that your research is going to get scooped? In practice, this very rarely happens. So even though we do develop in the open and we write these codes before we've even written the publication, you're able to see sort of the working process. We've never had our research scooped, and actually it's in our eyes, it's a good thing if people use our code. So the license of this code is specifically written to encourage reuse by other people, because if other people are using the code, this is hopefully a sign that this is a useful tool for people. And it also means we'll catch bugs faster, because the more people who are using the code or developing on the code, the more likely it is that we'll come across bugs, and that we can catch those before those bugs make it into a published bit of research, which is obviously the worst case scenario, is that we publish something and then after we publish it we find a bug. So it's better for us if we find bugs before we publish. So PyMatchN, as a result of this, is now used by over 300 other tools and codes in the community that depend upon it. So I really want to try and advocate for the idea that open source software is essential for reproducible science in the computational community. So anyone can request to add or modify code in PyMatchN. Anybody can go onto PyMatchN and click edit and suggest a change to how this works. These changes are submitted for approval from the package maintainers. Help is available for new developers, and then every change is tested automatically to make sure that it doesn't break an existing feature, and this is how we help maintain code quality. So we now have over 100 code contributors to PyMatchN. And crucially, a lot of these contributors are people that we have no prior professional relationship with. So people will come to the code, maybe they'll find that it's useful or that it might be useful for their research, and they want to get involved. So they submit, say, edits that they want to make to the code. And these are people that often, the core maintainers on this project have never actually met before or interacted with. So this is, we're trying to create an environment where everybody feels welcome to contribute if they want to contribute. And we try and guide new developers and help out new developers if this is the first time that they've worked on a software package before. All contributors are acknowledged with org IDs on our website, but I'm talking about PyMatchN here today because it's a useful case study. It's really how we're trying to run all of our codes, but we're still trying to work out how to appropriately recognize the contributions of developers who come to this project late, say after an initial publication. So we're trying to be responsive to those needs and figure out whether we need to write follow-up papers to make sure that everybody who contributes to this project in later years also gets appropriate recognition. So when I'm working with a lot of students, and a line that I hear a lot is that I want to participate, but I don't know how to get started. This is especially true for students I work with who are already writing code on a daily basis. They're writing code for their research, and writing code is essential for that research process. And, they do want to participate, but they don't necessarily know how to get involved. So I just wanted to put up a slide just to outline the rough process. So first of all, is to take a look at the documentation or to take a look at our workshop materials to learn about the code and see if it's useful for your individual research. Secondly, is say hello. So we have a lot of places to interact with the community. So on the GitHub website for this project, there's an issues page where you can add a post if you have a feature that you want or if you find a bug. We also have a community forum at matsci.org where people talk, and you're also very welcome to reach out and email individual people like myself. Then you propose a new feature that you're interested in or describe a bug that might be causing problems for research. This in particular to try and avoid duplication of effort, because maybe more than one person is working on the same feature, or maybe more than one person has encountered the same bug and might have additional context to provide to help fix that bug. And then while working on the code, you can submit what's called a pull request to share a draft of your code. And this is similar to, say, the peer review process, because it allows code maintainers an opportunity to provide feedback or to ask questions and to collaboratively work on that code to make sure that it matches in sort of style the code that's already in that particular package. So next, I want to talk a little bit about the process of doing materials design using these codes and pivot a little bit to talk about machine learning. So we can ask the question, how is this data useful? So this is another common question that I get when talking with people, especially sometimes in experimental contexts, because the materials project mission statement is not just to generate this data and to make it available, but it's to make it useful for the design of novel materials. So how do we do this? The general approach is a screening funnel. So I saw some of the talks on the first day and the second day also had screening, I think, in the context of thermoelectrics and perovskites. So I know some people here are already familiar with the idea of a screening, but the basic idea is that you start with the idea of what properties you want your material to have. So you start with this database of 100,000 crystal structures, and you sorry, I just got a notification from Zoom. Is everything okay?
Seems to be okay here.
Okay, great. All right. Sorry about that. I just got a notification. I thought my screen sharing was interrupted. So the idea of the screening is that you have different criteria that your material needs to satisfy, and that you can progressively filter down from this database until you only have a handful of materials that you need to consider in the lab or need to consider through more in-depth study. And then at the end of this cycle, with the information that you have, this is when you can start to train, say, machine learning models to obtain additional insight, and to start this process again, maybe generate new crystal structures to augment your database and calculate properties again and filter down again to get a new candidate pool of materials. So this has been used with success to synthesize materials with good properties for real-world applications like carbon capture, phosphors, photocatalysts, thermoelectrics. I'm conscious of time, so I won't go into this too much. One project that I worked on was for magnetocalorics. So just to highlight this as a case study, so we screened materials for descriptor, which was sensitive to the amount of magnetostructural coupling, so how much a material will change when it's exposed to a magnetic field. This is associated with a temperature change, so magnetocalorics are very interesting for new sort of energy efficient refrigeration devices. So through the screening process, we proposed a new magnetocaloric. It was synthesized. It was found to have good magnetocaloric properties. So given that this process can be used to find materials, what is the role of machine learning here? So machine learning can be useful for material scientists for two main reasons. It can be used for prediction, because good predictive machine learning models can speed up computation by maybe, say, a factor of 100. So this bypasses the need for more expensive calculations, which means, first of all, they're easier to perform. We don't necessarily need high-performance computers to run an ML model. And it also means they use less energy. There's less of a CO2 cost to running these calculations. They're also useful for inference. So models, especially when you have high-dimensional data, very large number of data records, machine learning can be used to find hidden relationships in a data set that might be overlooked by a human. However, the machine learning field is very new. It can be very difficult to learn for an outsider. I consider myself to be an outsider in the machine learning field, so I find it very intimidating sometimes to keep up with best practices. And we also have an additional challenge in material science, because we're very often in a data deficient environment. So machine learning to work well needs a very large amount of data. So efforts like the Materials Project and other databases that are similar to us can help supply data to train ML models. But even so, ML is not necessarily always the most appropriate tool for the job, which I think is just worth emphasizing as well. So we do have tools available to make ML easier to use for the material scientists. So as I mentioned, I consider myself a bit of an outsider to the materials learning field. And the academic effort required to develop new cutting-edge machine learning methods is very different from the academic effort required just to use a machine learning method for, say, a given data set. So, if you're a scientist who's a materials scientist who just wants to use machine learning, how do we get started? So a machine learning pipeline consists of sort of several fundamental steps. You have to have data coming in, such as from the Materials Project, and you have to go through these 4 steps to get an ML model out. So to go through these steps one by one, first, you have to featureize your data. So this converts your data into features that might be appropriate to use as a model input. For example, a crystal structure on its own cannot be poured into a machine learning algorithm. A machine learning algorithm has no concept of what a crystal structure is. But it can understand a number, a scalar number, like density or volume. And so these might be good features that describe a crystal structure. And there are... Sorry, I'll go back to this in a second. And then data must be cleaned. So for example, a lot of data, large data sets are very noisy. They might have bad data in there. They might have missing data in there. So there have to be strategies for how to handle that. And also data might need to be converted into a representation that is more appropriate for an ML algorithm. For example, the string for a chemical formula like gallium nitride can't be used directly by an ML algorithm, but a vector representation of this string where, say, the value 1 corresponds to that element being present and a value 0 corresponds to that element not being present might be a useful representation. So after data is cleaned, it has to be reduced so that, for model efficiency, you're only using features that are actually useful to improve the predictive capability of this model. And then finally, you can do the learning itself. And, there are many machine learning models to choose from these days, and each has different parameters that can be tuned. And this is actually, a very a very time-consuming process. So what tools do we have that can make our lives easier here? Well, we have tools like MapMiner, which is developed by the Anubhav Jain group at LBNL, which helps featureize material science data. So you can take in things like crystal structures and band structures, and it will give you out a table of features for that data. And, you know, if you're working on an ML algorithm, you might have some really useful features that are very specialized to augment your data set. So, you know, obviously you can always add additional features to that. And I think maybe later today we'll be hearing examples of that. But MapMiner is a good place to get started. Then there's another tool called AutoMapMiner, which is part of a family of tools called AutoML that really does the rest of this process, which is about automatically finding and selecting good features, doing this data cleaning, doing this feature reduction, so using models like PCA to find which features are most useful, and then trying a variety of different ML algorithms and exploring different hyperparameters to find a decently performing algorithm. So again, you know, this is not meant to be a substitute for really in-depth study of machine learning and novel algorithms, but it's a really useful tool for getting started, and it's one that I've enjoyed using myself. So,
Matt, it's probably time to wrap up.
To wrap up. Thank you very much. Okay, that's great. So, this is the end of this section, actually. So, I just want to highlight this sort of new platform that we're developing to help people share their work, and then I can conclude. So, how do we find information about materials? So we've been very lucky with Materials Project that it's kind of caught on. We get a lot of traffic from Google. So we now have something like 200,000 registered users, and this is sort of doubling roughly every year. So a lot of people end up on Materials Project by just entering in a Google search for a formula, and, you know, and they arrive at the Materials Project that way. So, you know, what can we do with this? Can we use this to sort of help make our own research more discoverable and help scientists find each other who are working on the same crystal structure, help scientists find each other's work? So we have a new effort for this called MP Contribs, which is meant to help sort of bridge this gap so people can upload their own data, and then their data gets shown on the Materials Project alongside the data that we generate ourselves. So this was the case study I was going to show of one project where they generate some band gaps, and they link out to Materials Project. So from their paper, you can get an interactive landing page to explore the data in their paper, and then that links to Materials Project. But then likewise, you know, if you get to Materials Project, you see the data from their paper, and you can click through and find their paper that way if you arrive from Materials Project. So this contribution framework is now open. We're accepting projects and sort of testing this system out, so it's still quite new, but we're eager for people to try it out, and we're hoping that this will be useful for people and that maybe this will catch on. I'm starting to use this myself for some of my own research that is kind of outside the Materials Project domain. Okay, so this is just to summarize the talk. So the Materials Project offers this computational database free of charge without restriction. It's supported by this collaborative coding environment where we write code in the open, and we work with a very large community of code developers now to develop these tools. Some of these tools can be useful for machine learning applications that can help bootstrap machine learning efforts by doing a lot of the manual labor that's usually required for making a machine learning pipeline. And we also have this new contribution project that I just mentioned. So Thank you very much for attention. I just want to show some acknowledgements. So to the Pearson Group especially, so I'm a member of Christine Pearson's research group, and to the Department of Energy for funding Materials Project. And just mentioning again that Matt Miner, those machine learning efforts are led by Anubhav Jain at LBNL. And finally, the purpose of this workshop is collaboration, so I'm really happy to be a part of it, and I really want to talk to people. If any of this is interesting to anybody, please drop me an email and I'd be happy to chat. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt, for this great talk. Time for questions. Oh, there's one in the chat. No, not yet. I have a broader question. So, Matt, if you look at this now, this has been going on for about 10 years, this project, and it's clearly influenced a lot in the field. Where do you think the most exciting developments are over the next 5-10 years for this project?
I actually, so one of the themes is that computation gets cheaper and cheaper, right? So it's like every year, maybe our computational excuse me, sorry, it's still early in California. Our ability to run calculations gets easier, right? So what I'm actually hoping for is that maybe in 5-10 years, the materials project as it is today may be not necessary anymore, right? Maybe you can generate the whole database in a week, right? Maybe what took us 10 years to do would take a new researcher a week to do, which means that then we have new challenges, right? Which is how do we keep working on the cutting edge of this field. So maybe we can do, more exciting calculations that maybe weren't feasible in the past, like GW calculations or things like that. I'm also very optimistic that, I mentioned that we're currently in a data deficient environment. So these machine learning algorithms that are very exciting, we often don't have enough data to really take advantage of them. So I'm really hopeful that maybe in the next 5-10 years, we can really generate enough data in our field to take full advantage of these algorithms.
Thank you. Any other questions for Matt?
Hi, I see somebody's got their hand raised.
Oh, please speak up. I don't see that right now on my screen. I think people should be able to unmute themselves. There's one more question. Is the data and material project linked to other materials databases, e.g. the topological materials database?
Yes, that's true. So we do link to the topological materials database. So when you look at a crystal structure, you can see some topological properties of that material, and then that links back through to the topological materials database. We're also developing our own workflows for topological materials. So if you're interested in that, you can check out this animate tool that I mentioned, and maybe that will be helpful for you for running calculations on topological materials. Is there any progress for organic materials? So yes, I would say that though I'm very proud to be part of Materials Project, very happy to be part of it, we don't do everything, and nor should we do everything. And there are other databases that are very good. And there's one of them which is for organic materials. So there is an organic materials database, and I highly recommend that. Is Materials Project part of Optimad? Yes. So for people who are not familiar, the Optimad initiative, is an initiative to try and make all these different databases interoperable so that you can make the same query against one database, like the Materials Project, that you make against another database, say like the Crystallography Open database. So Optimad is an initiative for that. We are very happy to be part of the Optimad initiative. The paper's coming out soon. Currently, the Optimad API just lets you search and retrieve crystal structures. So if you want to retrieve properties like band structures, you still have to use the Materials Project API rather than the Optimad API. Okay. Yeah, thank you for the question very much. Gemachis, I
Yes, yes.
apologize if.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I'm very happy to be one of the participants. So I have one question.
Mm-hmm.
Even the inorganic compound is sometimes I couldn't define from the material project. For example, I am focusing on cathode materials for battery, cathode materials for battery.
Mm-hmm.
So what I do is just I choose another isostructured material, and then I relax the material, and then I use for my calculation. But I'm not sure how much this one is advisable. What do you think? Is it advisable to do that?
You're not sure if it's advisable to. So you're saying that when you're looking at cathode materials, you take a material from the materials project and you do a substitution. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a good approach to take. So we have some projects for searching for cathode materials for multivalent cathodes, and that's exactly what we do. We start with existing materials on the materials project, and then we will try different substitutions to see which ones are energetically stable, and then we will go through a process of intercalation, so adding whatever whichever intercalant is relevant, and seeing how the voltage will change then for that material. So yeah, I think that's the ideal approach, though it's not the only approach. Does that answer your question, or did I
Yes,
misunderstand?
yes. Thank you, thank you.
Okay, I'm happy to talk about this more later as well, if you want to send me a chat.
Thank you, Matt. I want to thank you in the name of all the participants for the excellent talk and answering all the questions. I suggest that we have a brief talk and that we meet here at 9:50 for the next set of 4 talks. Thank you.
Thank you again, everybody.
Bruno, this is Amy. Can you hear me? Everyone is just sitting quietly. That might be why you're not hearing anything right now. We're still on break. We have another minute or two, and then we'll be back.
Aditi, thanks for sharing the slides. So I think it's working nicely. We can see the slide.
Sure. Sounds good. So you can see the whole screen and everything.
The whole screen, just the way it's supposed to be, not the other
Good.
presenter screen. Yeah. Okay, so in the interest of also staying on schedule, I think everybody is hopefully back. So we're going to have a set of 4 short talks, 10 minutes each. So I'll ask the speakers to please try to stay on schedule, that I don't have to remind you. But if it gets close to 10 minutes, I will speak up. The first speaker is Aditi Krishnapriyan from LBNL and UC Berkeley, and she's going to tell us about machine learning with persistent homology, improving prediction accuracy and interpretability for materials. Go ahead.
Great. Thanks a lot. So today I'll be talking about areas of how machine learning can be combined with computational mathematics. So this is the intersection that I work on with a lot of problems, and I'm very interested in applying this specifically to a lot of different types of materials problems. And I think there are a lot of useful ways it can be used with these materials problems that we care a lot about. And so the idea behind machine learning is that given some data set, you can extract patterns from that data set, use this information to make accurate predictions about something that wasn't in your original data set. And so the potential gain of this is that you save a lot of time by doing this. So if you have some material, instead of running the calculation or doing the experiment, you can actually run it through some algorithm, and it just tells you this is the material property we care about, or this is the behavior at some future time step that we care about. And so this potentially, the reason I think this has become very popular is because the possibilities are endless. If you have a good algorithm that can do this, you can screen a lot of things at once without having to do the much slower computation or experiment behind it. But I think there are still a lot of challenges in successfully applying machine learning for these materials applications. And I think these challenges are really, they're kind of the bottlenecks to truly being able to use this and say that we can just use machine learning for all of these problems. Because of course, the other aspects like the simulations, the experiments are also extremely important to actually verify the predictions. And so I'm going to just outline a few of the challenges I think that are faced in these machine learning applications. And one of those things is on the previous slide, I had this black box that you start with the material, you go through you extract something from it, and that allows you to make a great prediction. Now, the question is, are there ways that we can actually automatically generate descriptors that work across all of these scientific predictions with less guidance, less handcrafting from domain experts? And as Matt mentioned in the previous talk, tools like MatMiner are trying to get at that question. The second thing is removing some of the black box of machine learning. So maybe you do make a prediction, but if you don't know why you made the prediction that you made, is it actually that useful? Because we need to be also extremely careful about the predictions that are just coming out of this algorithm. What if they're not transferable to something? What if they have harmful effects? It would be useful to actually know what it is that actually helps. And in the case of materials, one example is maybe you have the material structure. Can we actually figure out what it's good about that actually makes it good to predict a property that we care about? And so I think it's important that we need these accurate models so we can trust the interpretations more. And it can also be useful to design new materials that we might care about as well. And in this talk, I'll talk about one such methodology that we've developed that can be used to address some of these issues here. And so the brief outline of this will basically be talking about this area of computational mathematics called topological data analysis, and then just show that it can be used to improve prediction accuracy and interpretability in materials. And so the area of TBA is cool.
Please go
Yeah,
ahead.
so the area of TBA. Okay, sure. Great. So the area of topological data analysis I'll go into is something called persistent homology, which is the way to capture and describe the underlying shape of a point cloud or some system of interest. It doesn't necessarily need to be a point cloud, it could be a function as well. And so if we have some material structure, for example, it would be useful if we can identify the topology of the system, like the channels or the voids in the structure. And can we actually use that information for something useful? And so if you see here, some materials have these channels and voids that actually sensitively affect the material's property. And so can we actually identify those and figure out how we can use those in some type of algorithm? And in the interest of time, I won't be able to go into details about persistent homology, but the idea is basically that it can track the changes in the homology groups of a sequence of simplicial complexes, basically the things that you see being formed here and being filled in here. And this is able to capture topological features in the system. And so in this example, you see that it's filling up different parts of the point cloud until you have one very big prominent void at the end. And so this idea of persistence or the topological features of your system, it can be represented as these things called persistence diagrams, which are basically the summary of all of the topological structures of the system. And so here you have different voids of different sizes, and the persistence diagram will be able to capture that. And so for this first quick introduction, the general rule is basically that n-dimensional homology will count the number of n-dimensional holes. And so if you actually compute these diagrams for all of the different dimensions, you can get a very holistic view of the topology of your system. So for this next part, I'll talk about how we can actually use persistent homology to improve the accuracy and also the interpretability for a materials application. And so this property prediction task, it's a challenging problem, and this is really the key to why we want to use machine learning, but also can we actually get it to the point where it's useful, we get accurate predictions across a lot of different challenges. And the reason for that is because if you have some structure, maybe it has a lot of different properties that come out of that structure, and maybe you want to predict those properties at a lot of different conditions. And so it would be extremely time-consuming to construct a different set of features for each of those problems, or a different algorithm for each of those problems. And even getting those to an accurate state is also difficult. And so I think being able to uncover these nonlinear relationships and actually be able to use one model for all of these tasks is really something that I think a lot of people are very interested in. And it's really one of the things that I think would accelerate the field. And so for this particular set, I'm going to look at this class of materials, nanoporous materials like metal organic frameworks or zeolites. These are, I think, the state-of-the-art materials when it comes to a lot of clean energy applications like carbon capture. And in this case, these are really complicated structures, and the porous structure correlates directly to important properties like gas absorption or catalysis or other types of things. And so we can actually use persistent homology to construct these detailed topological descriptors for these materials. So we can treat a structure like a point cloud, and we can actually compute these diagrams that represent all of the topology of the system. And then this is the workflow that we've implemented. I think there are definitely places where it could be accelerated or improved upon. But basically, we start with the material structure and compute all of the topology. We've also come up with a few ways. We've tried some ways in the literature, come up with some of our own ways to actually transform these diagrams into something that can be fed into a machine learning algorithm. So in this case, you see this is like a neural network, for example, and we do a pointwise transformation to feed it into the neural network, and then also learn that representation as your machine learning algorithm continues to train. And then we can go ahead and make some prediction about a property we care about, but this is really this last one is really what we truly care about, this multitask evaluation. So we can use this same model to identify the most important parts of the topology and make predictions across a lot of different tasks. And so in the previous talk, Matt talked about tools like MatMiner that will automatically generate features, which you can do, but these are more generic features, which are a good starting point. There's a whole community that works on porous materials, and over the years, they've come up with a bunch of handcrafted features for the very specific problem of metal organic frameworks or zeolites. So to get a really fair comparison for how well our method does, we went a step further and picked the best features that that community is using now, the most accurate features that you can get for these types of problems. And you'll see that they're very specific to the problems. So you might have something like density, but you also have accessible surface area or largest included sphere diameter. So these are really catered to the specific problem of choice. And so in this case, we want to predict gas absorption across many different conditions. And so for this case, we start with predicting methane absorption for a zeolite database, a class of porous materials. And we see that these baseline features, they do quite poorly at low pressures, but they do much, much better at high pressures because they were more handcrafted for those applications. Here, higher is better. So the higher we do, the better our model is. And so we see right away that this persistent homology pipeline immediately does better across all of the pressures. This is the same model being used to predict all of these tasks. And while the baseline features aren't able to do that, we do quite well even at high pressures. But more importantly, we also do really well at low pressures, which is also important for different applications. And so we can show this with a few different databases. So in this case, this is predicting carbon capture at different regimes or methane absorption at different regimes. And you see the very similar trends that the features that we use from persistent homology do much better across the board. And so we can keep combining them together with other features. And in this case, we also added in word embeddings, which can be augmented to improve performance. And so you see that we go from a pretty poor model for some of these applications to much, much better, something more reasonable, something that would actually make sense to use to filter or screen materials. And so finally, I talked a lot about interpretability and how when we make this prediction, can we actually figure out why we made the prediction we did? And so this is actually a really nice side effect of persistent homology, in that if you have some material structure, all of those voids, all of those channels are actually present in the persistence diagram itself. And it also represents some actual information about what can escape from a void, what can fit through a channel, and so on.
Aditi,
and so these features,
it's probably time to wrap up also.
Okay, yeah, just like a minute more or something.
Okay.
Yeah, so and so you see here that these features can be mapped directly back to the channels and voids in a material. So what that looks like is basically if we have some material that we care about, we can actually identify the void within it or the channel within it. And this, I think, is really useful because these classes of materials can be tuned for whatever ideal application you care about. And so I think figuring out what actually makes these materials useful, the voids or the channels, helps guide with that process. And I hope can actually inform the materials design of these processes. And so finally, in summary, I talked about how there are some bottlenecks in machine learning for materials. And this was one approach with computational topology to try to address those bottlenecks. And so one of those being generic features. And so we used that same representation and we're still able to get good error across many predictions. And finally, the other one was interpretability. So can we actually figure out the voids and the channels that are directly affecting a material's property? And then finally, I think this is a really exciting field right now because I think there's a lot of ways we can use computational mathematics for these science problems so we can extract information from more than just the structure like charge density or spectroscopy information. We can incorporate topology into the design of new materials. And this last point is something I work very actively on, predicting how a system evolves over time and incorporating ideas from numerical analysis into machine learning models for this aspect. And so I think the floor is very open for this area. And so if people are interested in any of these areas, feel free to contact me. I'm very interested in chatting more about this or talking more about a lot of the work in this area. And then finally, happy to take any questions, or maybe we're saving them for afterwards.
Thank you, Aditi. Yes, we're saving the questions for afterwards, so when the 4 talks are done. So let's just go ahead to the next talk. The next talk is going to be given by Alexandru Georgescu, and it's on machine learning tools for materials discovery and application to metal-insulator transition compounds.
So hi, can you hear me? Yeah. So I'm Alex Georgescu, and I'll talk about machine learning tools we've built, partly with PyMagen actually, and yeah, so I'll get into it. So I'm in the Rondinelli group at Northwestern University, which is in Evanston, Illinois. And I thought I should mention that because APS next year will be in Chicago. So, if you want to visit, you can just take the subway. It's a pretty cool place to visit. And, the topics of research in our group are quite diverse. So there's interplay of lattice modes and electronic properties, phase transitions, machine learning, heterostructures, ultrafast phenomena, multiferroics, and many of these are related to machine learning. And I'll also advertise that Lauren Walters from our group is also giving a poster today, so please stop by. So the focus of this work are quantum materials with metal-insulator transitions. So these are materials that, in this case, I'm referring to thermally driven metal-insulator transitions. So at high temperature, they have this high symmetry state and they're metallic. And as you lower the temperature, you have a broken symmetry state, both electronic and structural, and they become insulating, kind of like freezing in a way. And some of the tools we built, so actually all the tools I'll discuss are all described in a demo video I put on YouTube, which is now in my description on the website. But I'll get into that. So the idea is similar to what we've seen before, is to have an improved framework for materials discovery and understanding. So in our case, we also had to scan experimental literature rather than theoretical one, because that's the only way to really categorize these MIT materials properly. Build a database, and then we envision theory and experiment interacting with AI-based analysis to get new features, as well as new classifications and so on. And then this goes to new materials. So machine learning in a way is an opposite approach from what I normally do, which is, really focus on one material in detail and a particular model. So, and especially this reduces the bias of, what I can calculate is what drives the transition, which might not be true. So the first approach was to build this database of experimentally confirmed MIT materials. And this was a collaboration with Elsa Olivetti's group at MIT and her grad student, her undergrad at the time, Aubrey Toland, where through a combination of natural language processing and human searches, we were able to identify around 60 MIT materials, which is actually more than anyone else normally studies. So an example of this loop is, we would search, we found through natural language processing this one material, which is a scuterodite. We confirmed it through human inspection of the article that was identified, found this classification scuterodite, and then found another similar compound. And these are compounds and a class of material neither me nor my advisor, James, knew about, that they could be MITs. So as a result, we have this database, which is the first database of thermally driven MIT materials based on high quality experimental data. It's 68 total MIT compounds plus related compounds. So, you can think of, some correlated materials that don't have an MIT, but have similar stoichiometry. Our database is now accessible online. It's interactive, and you can plot our data set as a function of the different features we've built for this data set. Before training a machine learning model, as you've already heard, you have to have some features because you can't just put in a crystal structure. So what we did was we used experimental crystal structures and in their high temperature metallic form, because if you know the low temperature insulating one, you already know the mechanism, you know it's an MIT. So we really cared about like the less information. And we featureize these structures directly. So these are Python scripts. There's no DFT calculations or anything like this. This is a common question we get, whether you did DFT on them. We didn't. And these features are partially generated automatically from, MagPi, as you've heard before, but some we had to build ourselves, which, are kind of important for this class of material. And by ourselves, I mean Pewen and Nick Wagner built them. And so this is an example of how we calculate an unscreened Hubbard U based on ionization potentials, affinities, and transition metal distances. The model we used is a tree-based model, so it's XGBoost. It ended up working fairly well with only 10 features rather than, the over 200. You don't want to use 300 features on 300 materials. You'll end up with really bad overfitting. So we picked a bunch of features that we thought should maybe be relevant. We cycled them in and out, combined with features that were automatically obtained based on F1 scores as being important. And we obtained a pretty good classifier, I think. And one of the interesting things that is developed by some collaborators at Northwestern, so Dan Apley and his group, is that we can use this way of plotting the relevance of features called accumulated local effect. So what these do is, you can have a scatter plot of, the relevant materials you have. So here you have like the MITs as opposed to everything else. And that tells you where they are in your feature space. That doesn't tell you what the classifier says and what it thinks. And interestingly, we find that, these scuteridide compounds, which are over here, don't have a contribution from the Hubbard U or the metal-metal distance to their positive metal-insulator transition classification. And that makes sense. The ruthenium here is actually D0, and the mechanism is from samarium. So the Hubbard U doesn't actually play a role here. As you can see, it's huge because it's hard to ionize something that's D0. We've also extracted new interesting features. So this is the average deviation of the covalent radius, which is kind of a measure of how different your atoms are. And the interesting thing here is if you look at the rare earth nickelide materials family, you see this correlation between this feature ADCR and the MIT temperature, which is likely because, this ADCR is correlated with this tolerance factor, which gives you the ratio of the different atoms in the material and therefore how rotated the octahedra are. So it's possible this ADCR is some sort of generalized tolerance factor. And there's some other features that we get into in our paper, but for the sake of time, we'll get into here. And one of the things, as we've heard before, one of the cool things you can do with these machine learning models is you can build a pipeline. So we have a pipeline, and you can either go to GitHub and download the whole thing, or you can use it on Binder, which is just in your browser. You don't have to install anything. You upload a structure. You can see in the demo how it works in the video on YouTube. And basically, you will get a probability for the material of being in each class, as well as you can see where it is in the feature space with the feature space you pick. I'll also talk a little bit about microscopic models.
Alexandru?
Yeah.
It's probably time to wrap up. So if you...
So this is just like a 30-second thing. Yeah, the main point is that we've also developed a model. This is less related to machine learning on using disentangling the contribution of electronic and structural contributions to the MIT. I won't go into detail into this. It's in the demo, but the basic idea is it can tell you what the roles of the two are. And hopefully machine learning can contribute to that a bit as well. And yeah, so these are all the resources I've discussed, and you can see the demo in action, and all the links are there as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandru. So we've got 2 more talks. I'm actually giving the next talk. I will try to make sure that we'll stay as close on schedule as possible. Okay. I'm gonna, wait, this is the wrong one. Here we go. So I'm going to present some work which I've been doing with Stephen Xie in my research group and Matthias Rupp from the University of Constance on developing very fast machine learning techniques to explore the energy landscape. The idea really is that there are a lot of machine learning techniques out there approximating the energy landscape, and there's also empirical potentials out there, Lennard-Jones, Morse, EM, etc., which have been used for decades to explore energy landscape, describe the dynamics of materials. And so what I'm going to show you in this talk is that we can take ideas from these empirical potentials and ideas from these machine learning potentials to come up with models which combine the advantages of both, which can be highly accurate, but which can also be very, very fast. And so what we're going to do is we're using B-splines, compact B-spline basis sets, to represent these potentials in real space, express them as 2- and 3-body terms, and then come up with accurate spline-based potentials that are fast to fit, fast to evaluate, accurate, and easy to interpret. So Stephen Xie did most of the work. We also collaborated with Anne-Marie Tan, who is now a researcher at NTU in Singapore, and Matthias Rupp, who is a computer scientist at the University of Constance. And we have various computational resources and funding agencies which supported the project. So the basic idea is that we all are very interested in doing density functional theory calculations, but often we are interested in looking at surrogate models which can explore these landscapes faster. Those could be genetic algorithms to predict new structures. Those could be molecular dynamics methods to explore energy barriers and processes. Those could be Monte Carlo techniques to give us estimates for free energies, etc., of materials to predict phase diagrams. And so machine learning potentials have the advantage of being able to be highly accurate, as well as being very efficient in evaluating properties compared to DFT. They fit to reference data from DFT. They can be reparameterized with very little human effort, and we can simulate thousands of atoms. However, their functional forms are often difficult to interpret compared to empirical potentials, and they're not quite as fast as we'd like to go to something like millions of atoms or much longer timescales. And so, as always, in almost any computational technique, an accuracy-speed trade-off. And what we're going to do here is use a specific data set which was based on tungsten, the BCC phase, and various other crystal structure, various other defects, dislocations, vacancies, surfaces, etc. And we're going to use that data set by the group of Gabozzani to train our machine learning model and a couple of other machine learning models as benchmark. And we'll also use it for testing. We have a 20-80 split, 20% training, 80% testing. We're going to compare empirical potentials like Lennard-Jones and Morse, and we're going to refit them to the same data set. And we're going to also use an embedded atom model, which we didn't refit because that's a little bit of a harder task to refit empirical potentials because these are nonlinear complex optimization problems. And we're also going to compare against Gaussian approximation potentials, the SNAP and the Q-SNAP, so the spectral neighbor analysis potential and the quadratic variant of it. And what we're going to show you today is that these potentials we develop, spline-based potentials, can be as fast as EEM and Morse, so this is a computational cost compared to DFT, and can be as accurate as SNAP, Q-SNAP, and GAP on this data set using the same amount of data. So when you describe the energy landscape of a material, you start off with some functional form, for example, for a pair potential, and simply energy is given as a sum over those pair potentials, summing up over all distances. Calculate forces, and then you often in empirical potentials assume a specific functional form. There's also a systematic many-body expansion where you go from pair potentials to also include 3-body, 4-body, and n-body potentials, etc. What we're going to do is, instead of assuming an explicit form, we're going to express these pair terms as well as the 3-body terms by splines, specifically cubic B-splines, to be flexible and efficient. When you look at this expression here, for the many-body expression, you can see that the energy is actually linear in the many-body terms. And in principle, if your potentials can also be linear in your coefficients, that enables linear regression. Linear regression is a strongly convex optimization problem that has a unique solution and allows fast learning. And so what we're going to do is, we're going to use these B-splines, they illustrated here on the right, to express, for example, a pair potential as the sum of those B-splines. These potentials are linear in the B-spline coefficients, and we're going to use regularized linear regression to fit those coefficients highly efficiently in the time scale of minutes. So in the interest of time, let me just show you how this method works in the end. If we compare to other potentials, and we're looking at how much training data is required, we can show that these two-body and three-body spline potentials illustrated here can learn very fast with very little amount of data compared to Q-snap, snap potentials, for example. That's true for the forces as well as the energy. The two-body term itself saturates pretty quickly, so it isn't as accurate in the end as the three-body term, but the three-body term saturates a lot later and is essentially as accurate as some of the more complex potentials. These methods are highly accurate. I'm showing here a plot for how it's comparing to the density function theory and the highly accurate gap potential for the phonons. In this plot, we compare various properties, surface energies, elastic constants, the vacancy formation energy against DFT, and you can see that the two-body potential does better than many empirical potentials, including the EM, which was actually fit on those properties. The three-body potential does essentially reproduce the DFT, similar to what the gap potential does. Let me just come to the final slide. And so what I hope I've shown you is that you can develop machine learning potentials which are physically interpretable as two-body and three-body terms. And you can actually look at their functional form, which are much more accurate than empirical potentials, but maintain their speed advantage and are comparable to complex many-body machine learning potentials at a faster speed, similar accuracy. Thank you very much. So I think the next talk, so let me get back to Zoom. The next talk is going to be given by Omololu Akin-Ojo, and he's going to talk about machine learning, the superconducting critical temperature of metals. Go ahead.
I'm here, so give me a few minutes to share my screen. Okay, share my screen. Then I need to find the presentation. Okay. Home and view. What's going on there?
Looks
Okay.
perfect.
Okay, thanks. Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning to many, and good evening to many. So I'll be talking to you today about machine learning, our work on using machine learning to learn the superconducting critical temperatures of metals. So it's an application of machine learning to materials. This work was done by my master students, Firas Shoaib, who has now got a position in France under my supervision in Rwanda. So the goal of the research is to apply machine learning to predict TC. I'll tell you what TC is just now, for metals. So that means we focus on electron phonon superconductors. And so that's the first thing. We want to apply machine learning to predict TC. And then secondly, we want to apply the model we get from machine learning to search for potential new superconductors in the ICSD database. Okay. There's supposed to be a slide. Oh, okay. So what is superconductivity? So superconductivity, many of you know, some of you who are chemists may not be too familiar. So when you have a metal and you cool it down, this is how the resistance behaves to temperature as you cool it down to zero, a normal material. But if it's superconducting at a particular temperature called TC, the resistance drops to zero, okay? And the goal is to try to predict what is the value of TC. And different materials have different values of TC, and it's not easy to know exactly what is the value of TC. This is another property of superconductors, which is perfect diamagnetism, which I won't talk about now. We can talk about it later. So the main question we want to ask with superconductors is, which atomistic properties make a material superconducting? We have a hint from the BCS theory by Badin, Cooper, and Schrieffer that predicted Tc to be given by this formula. Theta d is the Debye temperature, which is expressed in this way. Lambda is approximately equal to the density of state at the Fermi level times the effective electron-phonon interaction. Okay. And if you look here, you see that theta d, the Debye temperature, the higher the Debye temperature is, the higher the value of Tc is. Our goal is to get a material that has a very high Tc. If you get one that has a room temperature Tc, you probably win the Nobel Prize in October. Okay, so this is, so Tc for metals depends on theta d, the Debye temperature, and the Debye temperature depends on a number of things. What we are going to do is we are going to use machine learning to try to predict Tc. And before then, we'll use machine learning to try to predict the Debye temperature. And before then, we use machine learning to try to predict the density of state at the Fermi level. So we think these are some of the things that the Tc would depend on a priori. Of course, like I said, theta d will depend on the mass and things like that. Okay, so our target is ultimately to predict Tc in the process, on the way we predict the Debye temperature, we predict the density of state. And we are going to use certain descriptors that we get from MagPy that has been presented before. We use scikit-learn to do the machine learning. I'll show you results from linear regression, ridge regression, linear and random forest, which I'll explain a little bit more. This is a slide just to show you how machine learning works. On top, you first use the data you have to train a model, and then you use the model to make predictions. So when we do the machine learning, so I'm giving an example of like theta d, the Debye temperature. The Debye temperature depends on a number of descriptors. Okay, I'll go back. So it depends on a number of descriptors, which are called descriptor 1, descriptor 2, and so on. Okay. These descriptors are descriptors that we get, are properties that we get from the chemical formula of the material. So you just give us the chemical formula of the material, maybe MgB2, and then from the chemical property of the material, what MagPy does is to featureize. So it's going to give you one of the descriptors that it's going to use will be the minimum value of the atomic weight of your compound, the maximum value, the mode, the value of the atomic weight that occurs the most, the mean, the average deviation, and things like that. It uses electronegativities, it estimates the melting temperature, it uses the Mendeleev number for the atoms that are there. So this theta d, for instance, will be a function of all these descriptions that I've mentioned. Okay. One thing you can do is just write it as a linear combination of all the descriptors, properties, and get the values of the constants. So that is called linear regression. Ridge regression is similar to linear regression, except when you find the coefficients, there's a small trick that you play. Okay. Random forest is quite different from all of them. What random forest does is it takes the training, say the materials, and tries to make decisions based on the properties that it gets. Okay, and so this is one of the random forest trees, and there are many trees, many decisions. So it makes a decision, and based on the decision at the end, it's going to tell you the value that you have for this particular property. If you want more details, I can give you a link to get more information about random forest. Okay, but these are examples of models that you use in machine learning. People also use neural networks, and you can use k nearest neighbors. So these are some of the buzzwords that you get that you can use. Random forest actually is the results are kind of equivalent to the results if you use k nearest neighbors. Okay, so I show now the result of the training. So we took data sets which are shown here. We took data set from Aflo. AfloLib is a website from Kutarolo's group in the US. So they have we took the from the database for 5,200 compounds. We also took the density of state at the Fermi level from 13,600 compounds. And then for TC, the target that we want to predict, we took it from a Superconducting database. And for metals, we were able to find 4,000 of them to be metals. Okay. And so we did the training, and our training on the left here, I show the result from the linear regression. The RMSE is high. The right here is the result from the ridge regression. The RMSE is high, root mean square error. And from the random forest, it has a lower RMSE. With no cross validation means we use all the data, training data. We do a similar thing for the density of state at the Fermi level. Random forest is better in every case. And then we did also the training directly for TC. And in every case, also random forest is better. Now we do cross validation. What this means is this result is too good to be true. What if you don't use all the results? What do you get? So what we do when you do cross validation, it helps you to have an estimate of the proper predictive power of the model for data that is not used in the training. So basically what you do is for k-fold cross validation, you divide your data into, say, for 5-fold, you divide your data into 5, and each time you use only part of the data for your training. And then at the end, you take the average and you see how well you do. When you do a cross validation, our results are worse, but they're more realistic. For the Dubai temperature, we predict our RMSE is 56.7. For TC, our RMSE is 4.361. Okay, what does this translate into? Before then, here I just show you from the random forest model, you can find out what is the most important properties for prediction of TC. So here you see that the average deviation of the column in which the elements are in the periodic table is important. The ground state volume per atom of the atoms, ground state volume per atom is important, and then the other properties are less important. It's interesting to note also that the atomic weight, mean atomic weight is important, as we think it should be. Okay, so here we just compare the random forest prediction to the value of the TC. All these compounds were used in the training set. So our deviation is small for many of them, maybe like 3 Kelvin for in this case. And then after you get the model, what do? You try to predict some compounds. So here we predicted some compounds that we think will be superconducting. We don't know yet whether they're superconducting or not. So what we are doing now is we are doing some calculations, some DFT calculations to check whether these compounds are superconducting or not. Using basically the mechanism we are using is the BCS electron phonon mechanism. So I conclude by telling you a few advantages of using machine learning. It makes your work faster. You narrow the set of compounds that you have to calculate your properties for. So instead of calculating the properties for all the set of, I don't know, millions of possible compounds, we've reduced them to like 10 that we'll check to see if they are superconducting or not. And then common research is what we're already working on, trying to see if these materials that we predicted to be superconducting are really superconducting. I'd like to thank APS and USAfrI for putting this program together. We'd like to thank Professor Gianmarco Rinanis at UC Louvain, who was helping us and teaching us many things about machine learning, and Dr. Correa Oses from AFLO, who helped us to get the density of states from the data. Okay. And I'll thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Well, let's thank all the speakers for the exciting talks. And I think we have time now, 20 minutes for questions from any speaker. So please enter your questions in the chat or raise your hand. I think we had earlier a question from for Aditi, and let me just read it. It's from Matt Horton. I understand one of the challenges with MOFs is identifying if and where hydrogen, hydroxyl, water are present in a structure, since these are often not included or identified during a structure refinement. Might homology-based descriptors be used to suggest what species might be missing or where they might be included in the structure?
Yeah, so this is a really good question, and it's actually one of the things I'm most excited about when using topology or topological data analysis for materials. So basically, the idea is that you can use this information to generate new materials, or can you incorporate aspects of a material to make material better? So there's actually a lot of recent work in topology and machine learning that allows you to both learn a representation, and the next natural step is that you can actually optimize a representation to target something. So let's say you want to make this really good for carbon capture, you can actually build that into your loss function and optimize the structure of the material based off of that, thanks to some of these recent new developments in machine learning and topology. And so these things can, I think, definitely be coupled together. So you can actually use an iterative method to do targeted design, including to modify a structure or suggest what could be added to a structure to improve some property we care about. So I think, yeah, I think that's definitely something that I think would be feasible with the current scope of the field. And I think is actually a very exciting area, potentially an area that would be a hot topic to go into.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We've got a question for Omololu for the last talk on the machine learning of superconductivity, also by Matt Horton. He saw that the melting temperature shows up as an important feature, and he finds the same thing in his work, and he's surprised by that. And I was wondering if, Omololu, if you have a suggestion or thought why this might be indeed be a useful feature.
I have no clue. I'm sorry. I mean, if you ask me about the mass, I can understand, because then the lighter the elements, the higher TCU will be. But for the melting temperature, I have no clue. I'm sorry, I don't know.
That's okay. I don't know either. Thank you.
My own suggestion for that, we thought about that also for a while, and because we see the same things, is that first of all, it's a melting temperature of the elements, right? Which is in MACPI. So that's of course a long distance away from the melting temperature of the compounds. But melting temperatures have to do with lattice vibrations. So maybe it's not completely surprising that in some cases there is some correlation between those strong lattice, very stiff lattice vibrations and some moderately high TC in those materials, right? But the jump from elements to compounds is something I don't understand either.
Yeah. So would you think that the higher the melting temperature, the higher the TC, or the opposite?
Well, you got to also be careful when you look at the compounds you have in those superconductivity database. A lot of them are, for example, A15 compounds. These are niobium and other refractory elements based. And those have intrinsically a moderately high TC of about 15, 20 Kelvin and a high melting point. So it may not always be that it's a real correlation between the fundamental process of superconductivity, but more the data bias to some extent,
Okay.
right? So
Okay.
there's another question for Omololu. Did you use
let's-
feature engineering technique and EDA before going to the training, or you just used max, min, etc. features from the MACPI repository?
Yeah, unfortunately, we just used the features from MACPI. So we didn't do any PCA analysis or any analysis. I think if we do that, we'll get better results, because then we'll be able to remove any correlation between the features. And so we didn't do any engineering technique or EDA before going to the training. We just used them as they were.
Okay, I'm just checking that I don't miss any questions. I had a quick question to Aditi about the homology also. Are you taking advantage that we know something about the size of the atoms in these algorithms? Because, I mean, you can use a point cloud, then treat every atom the same, but some atoms are significantly larger, and one would imagine drawing larger spheres around them may be a helpful thing. Is that something you build in?
Right, so that's something you can definitely build in. So these point clouds are basically treated as balls, like you noted, and so the atoms are treated as balls, and so different atoms will have different radii. In some of the studies that I did on this, it seemed like it actually didn't help that much to incorporate the atomic radius, so that when you were growing these spheres around each atom, it would be a different length depending on the radius. But I think it's still something worth trying to incorporate into your models, because I think depending on the application, it could work better for some cases versus others.
Thank you. I got a question from Gamachis for my talk. How about stability when predicting crystal structures using machine learning? So that's an important question, because indeed, when you use these machine learning models, they will, and then you do crystal structure prediction, they can go into part of the structure space where you have very little data in your training set. And in some cases, neural network potentials simply just fail. They diverge in energy, etc. And so the algorithm blows up. The advantage of these pair potentials, we've only tested the pair potential so far for structure prediction, not the three-body potential, because we looked at binary and ternary systems in that case. And the multi-component system, we don't have the three-body term fully implemented yet. And so we find that the pair potential is very stable because we can control the boundary conditions. With these spline-based potentials, we can ensure that it goes to 0 smoothly at large distances and goes to plus infinity at short distances. So we don't see that divergence. This will be different when we go to the three-body terms. And I think the concern, what happens when we have the three-body term turned on, that there could be divergences, just like empirical potentials themselves also have, is definitely there. It's probably less severe than in neural network potentials, and maybe some of the other Gaussian potentials, but it's going to be there.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions? Richard Martin has a question. You might have to unmute your mic.
So this is directly for Matt, but maybe someone else might answer or comment. I bet a lot of people are like me, kind of frightened by something that's got thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of information. Do you have some examples of somebody that starting and maybe a simple thing that they're starting on, where there's been some success?
Thank you. So you're asking something like a simple example of success for materials design, or do you mean a simple example of using one of these codes? Because they're subtly different questions.
Okay. For materials design.
Okay. I mean, it is intimidating. I share that, actually. I find it very intimidating because, when you're working with these very large databases, it's very difficult to, it's impossible to look at every single one of these materials, and it's very difficult to know what's in your data set and what's reliable and what isn't reliable. Yeah, especially because every data set has a bias, right? A computational data set might have a bias because we're interested in a specific application like battery materials or solar. An experimental data set might have a bias because, we're on the planet Earth and oxides are more abundant. So, there are a lot more oxides in a data set versus other materials. So I think necessarily it is a little intimidating. I'm not sure I have a very simple example. One that I kind of like because it doesn't really have an application, but it's just kind of fun, is there was a search for electride materials, which are materials where you have some electron density sort of ending up in gaps inside the material. So that was a very simple screening, just looking for materials where there was empty space in the crystal structure, and I thought that was kind of fun.
Yeah,
so
okay.
Maybe that's an example. I can share additional examples too. If you want some extra slides, I can send them across.
Yeah, that could be really useful if you somehow make that available for us. Even just going to the website is difficult itself. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We had one more question for Omololu from Matthew and Yalran. If I understand your work, you use a BCS description for TC, so electron-phonon coupling. Can you employ alternative mechanisms for TC that would be applicable to high TC superconductors or exotic superconductors?
Okay. So let me answer this question. So when we started, our idea was, since we had the BCS formula, we should just predict theta d and predict lambda by predicting the density of state at the Fermi level, and also train to be able to predict V, the effective electron-phonon coupling. And then while we were doing that, before we finished, we decided that why don't short circuit and just predict TC directly from all the material properties, which is what I showed you. Unfortunately, I actually believe that the mechanisms, because the mechanisms are different, it's better to separate the materials before you do the training, machine learning training. So for instance, what we did was for metals, which we think is really just electron phonon. So we separated that out. There's a work by the AFLO group also, where they fitted all the elements, all the compounds from the Supercon database. And they didn't separate them into whether it's electron phonon possibly or some other mechanism. So I really think the high temperature materials have some other mechanism, not electron phonon. Even if you look at ion p-nictide materials, is possibly magnons, that electron magnon coupling that is important there, possibly. So I think because the mechanisms are different, it's good, maybe even from a conceptual point of view, to separate them before you do the machine learning. So we have done the easier part to separate them into metals and non-metals. And even we restricted our TC in the training to something below 40, because we think those ones are likely to be BCS conductors. So, I mean, you could have some of them that are not BCS conductors, but we think most of them will be BCS conductors and they will just follow the same mechanism. If you want to do other exotic materials, I think it's good to group them. Definitely the ion p-nictide materials you should group separately, because I think the mechanism is different, and then do machine learning for those. And then the other ones also, the other superconductors, high temperature, you should put them together in a group and do the machine learning separately. So that's the way I would go. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. We got one more question for Alexandru. Nice presentation, thanks. How about the SIT, which I think stands for Semiconductor Insulator Transition Case?
We don't treat them separately. Wait, so you mean semiconductor insulating case? We just treat that as an insulator. The question is, do you have a band gap in the low temperature state? And do you just not have a band gap in the high temperature state? So that's how we have some materials that are like, our classification is, metal insulator MIT, and that's the criterion. And yeah, and one of the things is we have to use experimental structures only, because you don't have, DFT is a ground state theory. So no matter how good our theory would be, even if it was perfectly predictive, which it isn't, we don't have access to the high temperature state. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Just another reminder that in the chat, Matt Horton just added some of the slides from his backup slides of his talk. Want those, you should click on them while the presentation is going on, because once the presentation is over, the chat disappears. So just click on that one and download them right now. Okay, let's see what other question we have. Oh, from Yang Sun, for me, why this two-body or three-body potential can work so good? Does it mean the many-body interaction is not important in this case, or is it included in another way? Excellent question. First of all, the two-body, when we just use a two-body term, it certainly approximates the many-body terms on that data set. If you would go to very different structures, it would probably do worse in this system. The three-body term in most metals actually captures a lot of the many-body terms that's been known from empirical potentials already. I want to also put a caveat here out. We fit this specific data set on tungsten, which is mostly BCC structures in the data set. And in BCC, we know that a pure pair potential shouldn't work, but a long-range pair potential, we go out to 5.5 angstroms, and including three-body terms, should actually work quite well in that specific system. If you would go to organic materials, we would probably need a four-body term, and that's something we haven't yet implemented. So you're correct that there are materials where this would not work well. We expect this to work well for semiconductors and metals at 2- and 3-body terms, but double and triple bonds might need a 4-body term.
Okay, thank you so much. Very good.
You're welcome. Okay, other questions? We've got a couple more minutes. And thanks everybody for this lively discussion. Go ahead.
I just had a question for Alexandru, if that's okay. So this estimated Hubbard U, I had a quick look at your paper, but I'm interested how that is generated, what data goes into that, because it seems like, I'm not familiar with this ZSA model, basically.
Yeah, so we reference another paper in it about how it's built. I can send you the GitHub, which is much easier, I think, to see where all the featureization is done and so on. But this is how it's done. So we have ionization potentials for the transition metal ion, electron affinity, and then we also have the transition metal distance. So this is how it's calculated.
That's for the individual metal ions?
Yes, so it's a Hubbard U for the transition metal ions.
So what happens? So what happens in a situation where you have multiple different ions in the same crystal structure, for example, or one ion but it's in multiple symmetrically inequivalent sites? So say the TM-TM distance is different.
So the TM-TM distance is actually estimated. We have in this case, we estimate a mean, but there are various cutoffs. So ultimately, it's a mean. If you have a polyhedra, it will automatically pick, say, the anions right around the transition metal ion. If you have two, that's kind of a problem. And at this point, I think we just pick one of the transition metal ions. But there aren't many compounds that do that. So there's some iron, copper compounds that have two, but the U you'd get would be very similar for both of them. It's like a double perovskite, so it doesn't really affect things that much. But yeah, so that's the methodology.
Okay, that was what I was missing. Thank you very much.
And yeah, it reproduces Torrance et al. Quite well.
Thank you. There's another question from Michael Cote to me. How about accounting for Born effective charges, in particular to account for the LOTO splitting with local potentials? So this is, of course, a concern for any local pair and three-body potential set. In order to allow for that splitting, do you need to include the long-range Coulomb-like interaction, if I understand it correctly, right? So this is something we certainly thought about, that one could, in principle, in addition to these moderately short range, so let's say 5.5 angstroms, still short range pair potential, and the three-body potential has the same range, one could add on a Coulomb-like potential, right, to the whole problem. So that would not hurt the machine learning process at all. What one would learn in that case would be the charges on the atom, and if I see that correctly, they are still linear, these coefficients. They might still be linear, these coefficients, in the potential. And in other words, you could still do that with a regularized linear regression, I'm hoping.
Right. Yeah. The question is, how would you determine these charges, from the local environment?
There are a couple choices. One is you just get them from the DFT calculation you start from. You simply calculate the Born effective charges and maybe calculate the whole tensor and try to learn at least the trace of the tensor or something like this in an approximate way. Or you just have them as... So my first instinct would be to just use them as fitting coefficients and just say we got some atom specific charges in an ionic material that might work. The problem, of course, is that these charges can change, right, depending on the configuration. Mm-hmm. And that is going to be a very hard problem. That's a hard problem in tight binding in classic potentials, and I don't have any other suggestion the machine learning potential can do differently.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let me see. Is there more? Okay, Alexandru has just added some more information in there for the U terms. So that's in the chat. If anybody's interested, please look at that. And if there are no other urgent questions, I think we should continue in our schedule. The next part is the breakout rooms, meet and greet the day's speakers, if I see that correctly.
Yes, Richard, we had planned this time so that people could have a little bit more one-on-one time with the speakers. So if we have all of the questions kind of for the panel and the group discussion, then I would say we can go ahead and the speakers can go to their rooms, and then people can run in there and follow them.
Okay. So I think everybody knows what to do. There's a button, breakout rooms, on the bottom of the screen at Zoom. And then you just simply go to the breakout rooms you're interested in or have your name attached to it. Thank you. See you all in a little bit.